Yours.
Okay, well, thank you for organizing the conference. We were told we were supposed to introduce ourselves very briefly. So my name is Reza Hasmath. I'm a full professor in political science. I've just moved back to Canada, my hometown, hence my accent. And previously I was a professor in Chinese politics at the University of Oxford for 5 years, and I was a sociologist prior to that at the Universities of Melbourne and Toronto. In many ways, I feel like I'm sort of similar stranger here, because I'm not an expert on EU relations in any form. I don't look at the EU for the most part, but I do look at China, and I do look at norms and values. I'm here for the next few months looking at how values are shifting in Poland. I think what's really interesting is to see how norms and values are shifting, both in EU and in Poland, and how this actually affects EU-China relations in many respects. We often think that if the EU is engaging with China, if the EU is actually engaging with China, its norms are being transferred from the EU to China. It's not the other way around. We often don't really think the bidirectional nature of norms transfer. One example of this is looking at intellectual property rights. On the website, you can actually find a paper in the International Political Science Review where we actually looked at how did the EU engage with China in intellectual property rights, which is a big sort of conversation now in looking at US-China relations at the moment. So what's really interesting looking at this sort of idea here is that there are often contradictory and competing claims regarding how the EU creates these strategic preferences towards China. Put in a very simplistic way, what's actually driving EU's sort of negotiations from a norms and values standpoint when it engages with China? And so this particular paper is looking at what norms, what structural arrangements, what predispositions, shall we say, is actually affecting how the EU is engaging with China. And in many respects, it pays homage to the first panel where they were talking about what's behind norms. And because of my own background, I'm going to approach it from a sociological standpoint rather than a political science one. What I'm going to suggest to you is that there are three behavioral approaches when it comes to looking at how norms are forged. And this actually influences the way in which the EU is actually engaging with China. The first one might be institutional theory. And so institutionalists, in this context anyways, suggest that the EU's preferences are shaped by structures, these sorts of rituals, these sorts of regulations. So in other words, it's interesting when the EU is engaging with China, they talk about rule of law. In fact, the last panel, you heard rule of law a few times. They talk about democracy. They talk about certain brands of freedoms and rights. These are often become ritualistic in many respects. Let me put it to you in a different way. I've spent a lot of time in China doing sociological studies there. And, taxi drivers are some of the best ways to actually figure out the heartbeat of a society in many respects, because they're usually very blunt with you. And I remember having this conversation with a taxi driver, well, a few taxi drivers, in fact, and he would talk about rights and norms. Not sure what's going on there. I'm quite far away. And we were talking about norms. We were talking about, rights and freedoms. And often this conversation got to the point where, well, do I want the right to free speech or the right to assembly if I can't eat? I need to eat in order to actually think about these kind of luxuries in that individual's mind. And in many respects there we are seeing that norms do have, it can be a luxury to articulate certain types of norms, depending on the society at large. So it's one way to look at norms is looking at this institutional sort of approach. And that is the sort of legacies and rituals. It's a sort of deterministic sort of account of change that assumes a sort of path dependency. Another way, it's also social theories, but what's really interesting with the institutional arrangements is that this is not the only way to understand norms and why the EU performs these norms when it negotiates or when it engages with a country like China. Another way to think about norms is looking through sociological and social theories. And so in other words, its socio-cultural factors might motivate social actors. Institutions can be perceived in this respect as cultural legacies or historical heritages. So we pay homage to the fact that if you look at documents in the EU, it talks about rule of law, it talks about freedoms, rights, etc., etc. And these are foundational sorts of norms. And effectively, institutions are embedded with this sort of culture, this sort of cultural nexus that's undergoing constant renegotiation. Something we don't seem to realize, or at least pay homage to, is the fact that norms are shifting. I think if most of you might be Polish, you are seeing norms that are shifting here, dramatically, in fact, and it's being performed in the political process. What's really interesting is that institutions generally do not reflect those norms immediately. There's usually a lag period between when norms are fostered and created and performed in the political process and how institutions, especially when they're outward, are reflecting those kinds of norms. Let me put you in a very simplistic way. There's more of a right populist kind of approach, more of a rightist kind of a authoritarian turn in a lot of Europe right now. And in fact, that would speak more to the Chinese in many respects. So as a Chinese scholar, it's kind of interesting just to see how Europe is going because I can understand it because I understand China very well. So in many respects, I would suggest that China and the EU should be able to actually engage with each other in a much more, at least from a norms level, in a much more credent way. In any respects, we can suggest that social theories do play a role. Another way to think of norms and the way it's forged is through agency and stakeholder theories. And the agency approach is suggesting that individuals are the primary determinants of their own behavior. So the stakeholder approach extends this analysis to relevant groups of social actors, arguing that the state, interest groups, companies, etc., independently create their preference orientations. The impact of institutional social forces is significantly downplayed here. Now, ultimately, in the literature and in academic speak, these theories don't actually complement each other. They're actually contradictory to each other. So I guess the exercise then is to try and figure out, well, what's actually going on when EU and China engage with each other? Is it one form of norm formation? Is there a complementary approach? The punchline, just because I'm going to run out of time, is simply that legacies, so European cultural legacies, European institutional legacies, often dictate how the EU engages with China. I have a few case studies, but I'm only going to show you one. If you're interested, the paper's there. What I'm going to suggest to you is that when you look at the EU and China, there's fundamental divergence in regime types, obviously. So one's an authoritarian state, and the EU is a mixed bag, but it's relatively not authoritarian. There's variance in norms, and there's growing imbalances in economic power. So there's this theorization that the EU, the inclination of the EU towards norms-based actions due to this preeminence of culture in determining behavior predisposes a normative clash. That's another way of saying there is going to be clashes between the EU and China, effectively, because norms are very different between both societies. I know I'm going to run out of time, but I'm just going to show you this one case study, and you can see the others if you're interested in. It's kind of interesting because on June 4th, in the next few days, it's the 30th anniversary of Tiananmen. And there was a EU-China arms embargo that was imposed shortly after Tiananmen in '89. The embargo was a direct response to what the EU perceived as China's strong disregard for human rights, at least in a political and civil bent, and freedom of speech. Now, it was quite rational at that point for the EU to engage in an arms embargo. There was, at that juncture, there was no economic variance between the EU and China. The EU was much more powerful economically. The reality is quite different now. So it begs the question, why continue to have an EU-China arms embargo when it doesn't quite make sense from a strategic standpoint? And so in many respects, what this case study would show is that security interests was not the only sole determinants, nor were economic interests the sole determinants. It was a cultural legacy. It's a cultural legacy of norm performance, so to speak, that the EU strongly believes that political rights and civil and political rights were being infringed, and by virtue of lifting this embargo, it might actually signal to the China that it was okay to infringe on that. And so here again is that performance of norms I'm talking about. And for the most part, I look at China-Africa relations, I look at MES status, market economy status as case studies, but they effectively point to the idea that for many respects, when the EU and China do engage with each other, it is mostly due to the fact that there are these cultural legacies that play a role. and it actually can be a hindrance for furthering EU-China relations. And in fact, when we're looking at US-China relations right now, we're actually seeing that hindrance coming to pass. So it's something for us to bear in mind when we talk about norms and when we talk about legacies, that it does play a role, and especially in the EU's external sort of behavior towards other actors. So thank you.